Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with Sunday school. Welcome to Spring Meadows. Today is a little bit different for Sunday school. We're going to do questions and answers. So there's no handout. There's no topic. I do have a handful of questions that I've received throughout the week, and I have some notes written on them. So there are some prepared questions, but I'm hoping that some of you will provide some questions this morning as well. So I will be kind of going back and forth between answering some prepared questions and then opening it up to you guys. You could ask a related question or an unrelated question, as long as it's within the realm of something from the Bible or theology or Christian practice. I realized that you could also maybe do church history or something like that. There's probably smaller chance that I'd be able to answer that question, but something in those lines are what we're going to look at today. So if you have questions like that, feel free to raise your hand and ask them. I'm going to take questions from you guys today as well, but I do have some prepared questions. Let's start by asking for the Lord's help in prayer, and then we'll get started. Let's pray. Father in heaven, we give you thanks for your abundant grace that you show us every day. We know that we're unworthy of your goodness and your love, and yet you pour it out on us for the sake of Jesus. Where our sin abounds, your grace abounds all the more, and we give you thanks and praise for these wonderful gifts that you've poured out on us. We ask that you would bless our studies this morning, bless our efforts to be in communion with you. Would you draw us closer to yourself, give us rest in your presence, allow us to worship you as befits your holy name, and would you allow us to benefit from this time together. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. So first, I have a few questions from Jackson Adams that I'll be addressing, and I'll just kind of go one by one, and then I'll open it up for questions after each one. So the first one has to do with technology. I'm going to paraphrase these questions just because some of them, were a little bit longer with explanations and things like that, but it was essentially, how is technology shaping our understanding of truth and authority? How is our technology shaping our understanding of truth and authority? And my response to that question would be, a little bit depends on what type of technology we're talking about. There's a lot of different, we could be talking about cars, or we could be talking about social media, right? There's a broad spectrum of types of technology. But if we're talking about internet, social media, artificial intelligence, those types of things, which I imagine he was talking about, I think there's kind of two extremes that our technology could negatively affect our understanding of truth and authority. In one extreme, we're sometimes too uncritical of things that we hear or read on social media or from AI. We just read it and assume that it must be true. Or maybe if somebody has enough followers, right, if they have one of the biggest podcasts in the world, we kind of just hear what they say and assume it to be true. We trust them implicitly. Or if somebody does like a short video online and they say, I'm a doctor, and then they give their opinion, we don't ask for their, where they went to school or what their license is or anything like that. We just trust that they are a doctor without questioning it. So I think we're sometimes too uncritical, including with, AI. We could be chatting with ChatGPT and they'll tell us something and we'll just assume that it's true. But the few times that I've used ChatGPT, it has told me lies. So we need to be critical of these things that we're reading and hearing online. The other extreme is that we could be too critical. Sometimes I find myself doing this, is, maybe we'll see a video online and we're like, that has to be fake. That has to be doctored, right? Or we see a picture of the moon, maybe, right? With Artemis 2 recently. We see a picture of the moon and we're like, oh, that's AI. NASA's trying to lie to us. And we're too critical. We're not trusting enough of people in that way. So those are two negative ways I think that technology could shape our understanding of truth and authority. We might not accept anyone's authority, or we might accept people's authority that we shouldn't. We're either too critical or not critical enough. There's also the reality, and this is following a famous book by Marshall McLuhan back in the maybe 70s or 80s. It was called the Medium is the Message, something like that. And the idea is the way that you communicate something shapes your communication. And so writing something down in a book will shape your communication differently than going on TV and talking about it. And so it's the same with the internet. The internet is good for some things, but it's not good for a lot of other things. And I don't think the internet is good for serious thinking or a serious conversation about religious truths, philosophical truths, things that matter most deeply to us as humans. I don't think the internet is best suited for those things, just because of the medium, right? The way that it works, the way that we interact with other people, the disembodied nature, those types of things make it unsuited for communication when it comes to some of the biggest questions of life. So that can affect the way that we see truth and authority. If we're only talking to people on social media about our faith, that's going to affect what we think about our faith in those things. So the medium shapes the message is another reality. Are there any follow-up questions to that, or did that spur a question in somebody's mind? You could raise your hand. and we can address that, or we could move on. But are there any questions that came to your mind through that? All right, then we can move on to the next one. The next one is related. Again, from Jackson, he asked what the pitfalls and the benefits of ChatGPT are. I'm not an expert on this, but I could tell you what I've observed and a few things. So first, the pitfalls of ChatGPT. I don't know if you guys have used it too much, right? It's an AI program that you can use online. You can ask it questions. You can just have a conversation with it. It'll just kind of talk to you almost like a person. But it's pulling sources from all around the internet and kind of collating them together into its answer. And so I think that's one of the pitfalls of ChatGPT. You don't always know where it's getting its answer from. It could be getting its answer from a really good source, or it could be getting it from a source that didn't know what they were talking about. So that's one reality, is that it's pulling information from all around the internet, and it might be pulling bad information from all around the internet, and you kind of have to figure that out yourself. Like I hinted at earlier, but I've talked to ChatGPT a couple times. There have been a couple times when I had a theological question, and I was like, I just want to see what AI would say. So I bounced it off AI, and it gave me an answer, and I was like, I know that's not the right answer. So I asked it again, and it was like, oh, you're right. Here's the right answer. And I was like, nope, that's still not the right answer. Try again. And it tried again, and it gave me the wrong answer a third time. Or I'll ask, okay, where did you get that answer? And it'll show me the book, and I'll be like, okay, I have that on my shelf. So I pulled the book off the shelf, looked at the page, and I was like, that's not what it says on that page. And then ChatGPT will apologize, and you're like, you're a robot. Why are you apologizing to me? But that's one of the realities. It's taking information from all around the internet, and there's a lot of bad information on the internet. So it could just be lying to you because there was some blog post that somebody posted 10 years ago, and they got the information wrong. So it's not, it's not being judicious in how it takes its sources from the internet. It can also make up sources. This is called hallucinations. It can just say, yeah, this is what this person said. And you're like, okay, show me the link to that website. And they'll say, it doesn't exist. I just made that up. I have a relative. I'm going to try to be vague about this in case there's liabilities surrounding this information. But I have a relative who works in the legal industry in some fashion. And there was a lawyer in her company who used AI to help write a briefing or something like that. And it ended up hallucinating a legal case to bolster its evidence. And the judge caught it, and it was a really big scandal in the company, and they had to fire the guy and all this stuff because the AI that he used made up something. It made up a precedent in US law. So that's a really big pitfall of ChatGPT. There could be inaccurate sources, there could be made up sources. Another big pitfall that I've seen on the news, which is kind of scary, is just people using it for companionship. Almost having a relationship with ChatGPT, going back and forth, talking to it as if it were a friend, or even, having a romantic relationship. I think I saw something about that on the news recently, but a romantic relationship with a robot. That stuff is happening, especially in the younger generations, and that's really scary, right? ChatGPT can't fill that void that we have for human companionship. It's not what it's for. We need connection. We need embodied connection, right, with each other in the room. And then before I take your question, the benefits of ChatGPT, really briefly, I think the benefits are it can simplify and summarize research really well. So you could ask it a research question like, I'm studying the doctrines of God. Can you give me a couple sources on the doctrines of God? And it can give you 10 good sources. And you're like, great. Okay, this one source, can you summarize what he says about the doctrines of God for me? And it'll do that. And then you can pick that book up off your shelf, verify that it's correct, and you can save a lot of time that way. So simplifying and summarizing research is a really key benefit of ChatGPT. And that could be in, a lot of different realms. It could be, diet and exercise. You could say, make me a meal plan for this week, and ChatGPT can do that really effectively. So that's what I would say the main benefit would be, at least for the stuff that most people would be doing. All right, we have a question up here. Yes.
Oh yeah, just sharing that there was a story out there that some guy had developed a romantic relationship on this AI, and it had set up a meeting, an actual meeting with him, and he rushed off in the night. He doesn't usually go in the night, and he ended up falling in some kind of a hole in the subway or something. He ended up dying. It was really crazy, but
wow.
Yeah, that happened.
Yeah, that stuff happens. Question, yeah?
I'll frame my statement as a question. I was flying with a guy last week, and he was kind of deciding, do I stay with this company or another one? He pulls out a 5-page conversation he had with AI, which I thought was silly, but I read it, and I was like, that's really helpful, actually. But I guess my question is do you see the danger and people will start turning to that for like real personal counsel, not coming to someone in the church, to their leadership? You use the word disembodied, and I guess that's a concern of mine, that we would think we would get some kind of a practical benefit without that human interaction.
Yeah, definitely. I think so many of the technological advances in recent years, including like social media and all of that, it's ignored our nature as humans, that we have bodies. We need to be in the room with somebody else to have a real connection with them. We need to look them in the eyes to have a real connection with them. And ChatGPT can't give you that because they don't have any of it doesn't have any of those things. A person that you meet on social media at least has those things. You could meet them later, but ChatGPT can't. And so and again, the medium shapes the message. So having a really deep personal conversation about your future, asking for advice, it can be a good starting place maybe, but it's not a good medium for that type of communication. Because it's not fit for that serious kind of topic and that kind of thing. Yeah. Okay, over here. I saw the hand. I was trying to finish up my thought. Thank you. Questions? Yes.
Here's my experience with ChatGPT, but I have to preface it with a story. My daughter gave me a really strange Christmas present this year. You may not know this, but my undergraduate degree is in fine arts. I'm a printmaker. And she said, Dad, here's my present to you. Together, we're going to do linoleum cuts, but all of the linoleum cuts are going to be based on the attributes of God, which she knows I'm very passionate about. So I thought, man, how do you do linoleum cuts based on the attributes of God? So I asked ChatGPT. I said, ChatGPT, tell me what a lino cut would look like from a Reformed perspective of God's aseity based on the woodcuts of Leonard Baskin. I was shocked. It was so totally accurate. I have never seen a better summary. Then ChatGPT says, would you like me to give you the same summary for the doctrine of God's simplicity? I said, yes. And I thought, this is the best stuff. This is the best summary of God's attributes I've ever read. I mean, it summarizes them, like aseity, no beginning, simplicity, no parts, and it just kept going. Would you like God's immutability? But if you know a subject and you're asking, I've dealt so much with those attributes that I would have spotted it in a second, but I was just gobsmacked at its ability to summarize, and even in,
I just have a quick question. Are you using ChatGPT like the word Kleenex, or are you? Because I use Grok.
Okay.
I don't use because I don't trust it.
Interesting.
So, is it all?
I was addressing the question which was on ChatGPT in particular.
All right.
I wouldn't be surprised if that question was about AI softwares in general.
In general, right.
And I'm sure my answer would be similar. I haven't interacted with the other ones as much. I know they all work a little bit differently, I think. They all have like a little bit different sources that they're drawing from and things like that. But
I found it very helpful, but you have to ask it the right question. Like you have to, if you
Yeah.
want reformed information, you have to use that word.
Yeah.
Like you have to be very specific.
And I guess that's the other danger, is that it can create, I guess, what we call like a confirmation bias, where it's telling us what we want to hear. Especially if you have a ongoing conversation with ChatGPT and it gets to know your views and things, it'll just tell you things that fit with what it already knows about you, and that could be a lie, and it could be leading you astray potentially. Obviously, you want it to give you answers from a certain perspective, but you also don't want it to, lie to you just to tell you what you want to hear. All right, question over here.
I guess I'll say, the company I work for, we actually have our own version. We call it Eva, something virtual assistant. And, we've talked about this before, brother. I've come, we have to have a doctrine of a tool. In my line of work, everything we do, there's a tool for this, there's a tool for that, there's a tool for everything. And I think we have to bring that perspective to these large language model tools. It's a tool. And I would agree that having a conversation, an intimate one with a tool is inappropriate. It's just...
Yeah, imagine talking to a hammer about your career.
I think
it's similar. Yeah.
However, they're building these things for that,
Yeah.
and it's sickening. But I think if we come to it with that understanding, that framework, that this is a tool, it does what I tell it to do, and you set the parameters. It's a great resource. I think when you learn how to use it, it can do what you want it to do.
Yeah.
And, effectively. But
That's helpful. And I think that kind of applies to what I said about technology in general, is that, social media, internet, all of these things are tools in the same way. You can't, use it for every task that you want to use it. It's a specialized tool, right? You can't use a hammer to fix your sink necessarily. You can't use social media to have a deep, meaningful conversation about faith and, your future and all these things. It's just not fit for that. It's not the right tool. That's a good point. Okay, I'm going to move on to the third question from Jackson Adams. So this is, it was inspired by a tweet that he saw from Tim Keller, where he was saying, it was something like, our ancestors, kind of had the blind spot of supporting slavery. Like everybody did it for thousands of years. They had slaves. So it was kind of a blind spot. Like they couldn't have known that it was, as bad as we think it is today. And then, Tim Keller went on to say, 100 years from now, people are going to look back on us and say, how could they have not, seen this? This is such a serious cultural issue. This is a blind spot. So Jackson asked, what are our blind spots today that hopefully, 100, 200 years from now, we're going to look back and say, what a huge mistake that was. And so I have two kind of categories of answers. One is for the culture at large, and one is for the church. So for the culture at large, I at least really hope that the blind spots that we'll look back on and see as huge mistakes are abortion and transgenderism. Those are things that are widely supported by many people in our culture, kind of similarly to slavery hundreds of years ago. But they're just as destructive to human life and to our culture, if not more destructive than slavery. So that's kind of a simple answer, but abortion and transgenderism, I think, that's at least my hope and prayer, is that we'll look back and say that was a horrible mistake that we supported those things. And then in the church, the blind spot that I would say, I hope we look back and regret it, I guess, is Christian nationalism, this kind of fad that's going around in the church today. We're wanting to almost go back a few hundred years, even, like 400 years, to how we thought politics and Christianity should interact. I don't think we should do that. I think there was good development. I think the revision of the confession was a good thing, where we put some distance in between the civil magistrate and the church. I think that's a good thing. And there are a lot of people, probably in some part, they feel empowered by the current administration and some of the things that are going on there. And they want to go back to this, kind of marriage of church and state, at least in some fashion. And I don't think that's the right thing. So I hope we look back on that and say, yeah, that was not the right move. Are there any questions that have been spurred in your mind from that one? Questions? One over here, Keith, in front of the crowd room.
So there's one thing that I did have a problem with, and it's more about the administration and how they threaten the Pope. How is that? How are we okay with it? Like, as a Christian community, that happens. Like, how do we feel safe coming to church, knowing that?
I guess I don't know what you're referring to. So
So recently Trump spoke about what's going on in the Middle East, and the Pope had a difference. And basically, the administration basically threatened the Pope and saying that, you should be on our side no matter what happens. And the Pope says, no, that's not what we do. That's not what God intended. We are intended to be here together fighting whatever it is that's going on. Not in our, we're fighting it constantly today, but I feel unsafe. I want to be able to come to church with my children, and that hurts.
Yeah, so I would have to know more about, I'd have to read what was said and stuff. I remember seeing something about what the Pope said about the war. I don't know what to say about that exactly, besides, civil government shouldn't be threatening church leaders. So I'd agree that that's not a healthy place for the country to be in. I think I'll just leave it on that. I agree that that's not what should be happening. Over here.
Well, I just wanted to state, sorry.
Is it a question? I
No,
think we need
it's
to
not.
stick to, okay.
It was a comment.
Do you have a question, Joel?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Joel. Sorry, I want to keep it to questions for now.
Better be good, Joel. Better be good.
Regarding what you said about Christian nationalism, there seems to be a spectrum of that in our society. There's this very hardcore wanting to go back 400 years type that you did, and then there's kind of what I would say Christian nationalism with a lowercase n, right?
Sure.
So the question that it spurs in my mind is what responsibility do we have as Christians to advocate for righteous and godly policy in public life? And to what degree do we take that? Is it something that we are burdened by scripturally, or is it optional?
That's a good question. I taught on Christians in, what did I do? Christianity and politics or something like that. So the recordings are on the website. So I have more, carefully thought out answers to those things on there. But I would say, yes, I think we have a broad responsibility as Christians to be engaged in civil life, is how I'd probably call it. And then how do we do that is another question. I would say that we're not trying to, I guess this is where, so I agree that there's a spectrum of Christian nationalism. Sometimes it's just used almost to bully people, you're just a Christian nationalist, you don't want abortion to be legal. That's not a Christian nationalist thing. That's just a civilized human thing to be against abortion. But on the other end, there are people who are wanting to have they call it a Christian prince. And so they want a civil leader to be a Christian and to influence the people under his care to be Christians. And that's kind of the capital C, capital N that I would talk about, Christian nationalism. That, I would say, is unbiblical. That's not the mandate that we have as Christians. We have some examples in Scripture, I think, of how we as Christians should be interacting in civil life. I think it should be kind of like Abraham and how he was interacting with the civil leaders in, before it was Israel, but in the ancient Near East and in Egypt, or Joseph when he was in Egypt and he was working for the good of all of the Egyptians, but he also wasn't trying to make it a Hebrew nation, right? Or Daniel in Babylon. Those are great examples. And then we have some New Testament examples. We just don't exactly know how they operated, but there is a treasurer of Corinth who was a Christian that Paul talks about in the New Testament. And we see like some of the evidence of his public works projects in Corinth today, which is really cool. We don't know how he operated as a civil servant, but we know that he did. He did it as a Christian, and it seems like, at least, he didn't try to turn Corinth into a Christian city by, having Christian laws about, these sorts of things like worshiping and all those. So, hopefully that kind of scratches the surface. But I have more online. Yes, question? Okay. I want questions, but I'll allow it
your
this one
last
time.
answer. In the Reformed tradition, there are a couple of camps that would respond to that question very different ways. There's Van Drunen's Two Kingdom theology, which seems to take a less engaged approach in culture and especially politics. And then on the other extreme, it could be extreme, was the whole Kuyperian experiment and what is often referred to as world and life view Calvinism, in which the church has a prophetic role toward government in the culture, which would basically critique, but not necessarily occupy. And so I don't know if that's what you're referring to. Christian nationalism, maybe with a small n, might be highly Kuyperian.
It could be, yeah. And I would just maybe respond briefly. I'm a big follower of Van Drunen. He was my professor. And I would disagree with the way you characterized it. It's not less engaged with culture or politics. It's just a question of how should we be engaged. So it once... I love you, Pastor Tim.
I've read Van Drunen. I am aware of what he says, and I agree with a great portion of it. But I also know the Kuyperian. I would suggest people who've only been exposed to the Two Kingdoms also look at another huge in the Reformed tradition. Maybe it's more Dutch than English.
Okay.
They're not the same.
Thank you. Yes. So I love and respect you. I've sat under him. I've read all of the different views. It's not less engaged. It's just how are we engaged. And I talked about that with politics and Christianity, right? So moving on to a question from Keith Turner. So he asked, basically, should we revise the Westminster Confession of Faith? He had a lot of kind of explanation and follow-up questions with that, but I'm going to address that. Should we revise the Confession of Faith? And I would say, should we further revise? Because it's already been revised in a couple of ways, particularly in reference to the civil magistrate. But should we revise it? And I would say, I don't think we should revise it. I think we should write an entirely new confession. And that's kind of my view. I think we need a new confession in the Reformed Church. And I want to clarify, not because I think there's anything wrong with the Westminster Confession. I don't think any of the doctrine should change. But the confession doesn't address a lot of modern issues in theology and the church that we have to be able to address as Christians. So I think a new confession would be able to address that in a way that helps us to address it in our modern situation. One of my professors Dr. Clark, who tends to be one of the most kind of curmudgeonly of my professors, he actually called for a new confession like 20 years ago in one of his books. So if you want to know more about what he said about that, you could look at his book, Recovering the Reformed Confession, and you can find that section where he calls for a new confession in the Reformed Church. One of Keith's follow-up questions was that the Westminster Confession reacts a lot to Roman Catholicism, and it frames its theology kind of in reference to Roman Catholicism a lot because it was coming out of the Reformation and all of these things. And he asked, is that helpful or useful for us today? And I would say yes. I think it's very helpful and useful today. We need to know our history. We need to know why we believe what we believe, how it developed in the Reformation, and we need to know why we don't believe what we don't believe. So I think that is helpful. It's also the case that the Roman Catholic Church is the largest Christian church in the world today. And so I think it's helpful to know how our beliefs would differ from theirs, and we can have conversations with them better if we have that pretty clearly laid out. It's also a very influential church in that it's receiving new converts every year. It seems like Protestants, especially younger Protestants, have been disillusioned with some of the more like non-denominational megachurch type of Christianity, where there's all of these like light shows and smoke machines and these things that kind of make Christianity less serious. And some of these younger Christians are swinging the pendulum to Roman Catholicism because it takes things very seriously. And so I think it's helpful for us to think through, okay, why would we discourage young believers from making that switch to Roman Catholicism? Why is Protestantism worth believing today? But on the other hand, Roman Catholic theology has changed over the last few hundred years, especially in the last century. And so I think a new confession would have the benefit of addressing modern Roman Catholic theology, which it's changed. And so there's different concerns, there's different disagreements, and those types of things. Another follow-up question that Keith had was, what would be some other modern issues in the church that we might want to address in a new confession? So I wrote a brief list. I think Karl Barth and neo-orthodoxy are a big one. Karl Barth, he was a Swiss theologian in the early 1900s, and he was probably the most influential theologian in the previous century, and not for the best in most ways. So I think addressing his doctrines would be really helpful in a confession. Addressing evolution, I think, would be really helpful. The Westminster Confession was written before Charles Darwin and his Origin of Species, so I think that would be helpful to address and how that relates to our views of creation and those things. Progressive theology and the various ways that comes about. Devaluing the history of Christianity, devaluing Scripture, those kinds of doctrines. Liberation theology, I think, would be really helpful to address. That's a form of progressive theology that puts a lot of emphasis on the earthly liberation of minority groups and people who are oppressed. So how do we, fit those concerns into our doctrines? How do we address the disagreements that we have with them? Revivalism and Pentecostalism, dispensationalism, the Word of Faith movement, or what we probably know as like the health and wellness gospel. Those sorts of things I think would be really helpful to address in a new confession. So hopefully that makes sense. Are there any questions that has spurred in your minds? Yes, over here, Kathy.
So what would it take to rewrite the confession, and how would it be accepted? Would it be divisive? Who writes it?
Yeah.
So if this is this grand idea, like, well, it would be nice, but realistically, is it realistic?
Very good question. And this is, whenever I've talked to Keith about this is what I've brought up, is that I don't think it's even possible, even though I agree that it would be helpful. So it would have to be a church document, right? It would have to be the church calling together a council to have this written. and it would bring in all of our best scholars and pastors and theologians to hash this out in committees and write up drafts, and then they would vote on the final document and pass it. But one of the realities is that we have a lot of good scholars and theologians today, but I feel like not nearly as many as there were when the Westminster Confession was written. There were over 100 people at the Westminster Assembly, and they all had to know Latin and Greek and Hebrew in ways that, I know Greek and Hebrew, but not nearly as well as they do, I imagine. And so I think it would be a lot harder than it was back then. And so I agree. Logistically, it would be difficult. Ideally, it would be, from all of the Reformed churches that are even similar to our denomination. We would all send our best people and come back with our best work. But I think it would be, pretty unrealistic for a lot of reasons. Yeah. Question? Yes.
Listening to you say the word new confession, I unlocked like a core belief in my head that I didn't really realize that I held, because I immediately went, how unreformed of you. Just immediately.
Yeah.
But listening to you, I realize I have this core belief that, there's nothing new under the sun, and that there are no new heresies. A new heresy is just an old heresy with a new name, or, et cetera, et cetera. Do you feel that there are new heresies that are not just old heresies recirculating with different makeup perhaps, but generally at their core the same?
Yeah. I'm sure that there are. I agree with the premise in general that most new false teachings are developing off of old false teachings in some way. So I would agree with that, but I do think there are some new things, like some of the ones that I mentioned. It's true. That's not exactly a heresy, but I know what you mean. Yeah. Like evolution, for example, right? That idea of, yes, follow. Just that idea of, a totally natural process in which, humanity came to be without divine intervention. That's a fairly new idea. So.
Right, but doesn't the right teaching of creation inherently expel any other?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, but a confession will also react to bad views and directly, show how they disagree with the right view, if that makes sense. So we need to have, our doctrine of creation wouldn't change, but we need to show how that doctrine of creation would refute evolution explicitly. Because somebody could say, well, yeah, I can believe in both at the same time, but we would say, no, these are the reasons why. Maybe you can't. So, yeah, and that would hold true with, I think, liberation theology. That's a fairly new idea, and some of the other things too. But yeah, that's a good question. And I would say, the Reformed tradition in general has always been a confession writing tradition. So there have been probably hundreds of Reformed confessions throughout the years. Maybe not hundreds, but close to 100. There's been a lot. And responding to different things, different developments. And so I think that's something that we can continue doing. That would be a sign of a healthy church, I think. Is this a question?
Yes, it is a question.
Great, thank you.
The Bible's revised all the time. And my question to you is, what is your favorite? Are you an ESV dude or NASB dude, or what are you?
Favorite translation of the Bible, is that?
Yes.
I usually just use the ESV. I grew up using the NIV mostly.
What's astonishing is when you look at, I'm going to tell a little story here, like Wayne Grudem, his whole thing on, the eternal submission of the Son and all that.
Yeah.
He's one of the major persons on the board of the ESV, and I'm going, wow, does that mean I should hate the ESV? We're talking about revising our confessional creeds, and yet the Bible's retranslated all the time. And I just kind of,
Oh, you're saying like maybe argument from greater to lesser. We should be okay with revising our confessions if we are so okay
well,
with
especially
revising.
to the extent that you use modern language and.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Agreed.
think the New City Catechism tried to do that, but I don't know if it was a little more simple than,
Yeah.
not as complex as the Westminster Confession. But, you know, my point there is we revise the Bible all the time. I mean, why couldn't we do that to our confessions?
Right. Right? Yeah. Question? Yeah. Okay.
So I will preface it by saying I am very pessimistic about changing the confession. Can't even get our assembly to agree on more basic things. That being said, assuming we can't change the confession, what do you think we could do either as a local church or as a presbytery to, I guess, do what you want to do, which is to make the confession more modern and relevant more relevant to a modern audience, in view, if you assume we can't actually change the confession? Like, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think that would just be a matter of teaching. So when we're teaching, we're not just addressing the errors of 16th century Roman Catholicism, but we're also showing how our doctrines address modern errors in these ways. And that's usually what I try to do when I'm teaching, is to say, well, this is how it refuted that, hundreds of years ago, and this is how it would refute some of the things that we see today. So I think it's probably, maybe that would address your question a little bit, but to explicitly apply our confession to our modern situation the way that we see it, even though we can't, write a new confession to do that in a concrete way, we can still do that ourselves as we're teaching and talking about these things.
Does it mean you plan to write a commentary?
No. Yes.
Yeah, just a comment. That's exactly what we're doing here, right? So you're going through the confession, in Sunday school, and you're redirecting and asking these questions that are more relevant to today.
Yeah.
But I agree that if you were to ask, especially the PCA Church, to rewrite, the confession, it would probably take at least 20 years, before you got to anything. So even if that. So we take what we have and we make it relevant to today through teaching and preaching of the word. So.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I think I'm going to cut it there. I have a few questions that people submitted throughout the week. I wasn't able to get to them because of time, but I'm always happy to take your questions. I'm always happy to talk with you about these things. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for engaging, and I'm going to do this again in a few months, so if you have questions that you'd like to have addressed later, just remember that, write it down, and send it to me, and I'll be happy to address it. So thank you for